The morning broke with a hush that felt almost sacred, the kind of silence that presses against the soul and makes every breath sharper, every sound clearer. Frost shimmered across the meadow, catching the first pale light like fragments of broken glass scattered by unseen hands. The air was cold enough to sting, to cleanse, to remind a man he was alive, even when his heart had long forgotten how to feel. Harland Vance rose before dawn, as he always did, carrying the weight of years etched into the lines around his storm-grey eyes. He moved with the steady rhythm of someone who had built his life on discipline, boots striking against the hardened ground, rifle slung low, breath steady, shoulders unbending even under the weight of silence. He was a man moulded by loss, one who had buried love beneath the roots of an oak tree and never returned. The ache of that farewell had driven him far into the wilderness, where the world expected nothing of him but survival. Here, among pine and stone, he had chosen exile, for it was easier to cut wood, mend fences, and fight hunger than to bear the memory of tenderness lost too soon. Yet, on this morning, the land seemed different, charged, restless, as though the earth itself was holding its breath, waiting to reveal a secret that would unravel the life he thought unchangeable. The trail drew him deeper into the timber, each step marking the familiar rhythm of solitude. He had not expected wonder nor interruption, only the lean promise of venison or rabbit. But as he pressed forward, the forest shifted, leading him towards something else entirely. Blood on pine needles, a shadow in the clearing, a shape half hidden beneath branches, too fragile to belong to the beasts he had hunted. His hand tightened on the rifle, instinct rising sharp, memories of war still raw, scars that whispered caution. Yet as he drew closer, the truth broke through his guard. It was no animal. It was a woman. She lay torn and trembling, her breath shallow, her dark hair tangled with soil and frost, her dress ripped by violence rather than time. Rope burns cut into her wrists, bruises painted her skin in cruel shades of blue and purple. Still, her eyes opened, steady and unyielding, daring him to choose between compassion and hatred. In that gaze, he saw not an enemy, but a soul clinging fiercely to life. And for the first time in years, something inside him shifted. The silence of his days would no longer remain untouched. He could have turned away, left her to the cold, allowed memory and fear to rule his choice. But his heart, scarred though it was, would not let him abandon her. With a muttered oath, he lowered the rifle, bent down, and lifted her carefully into his arms. She was lighter than he imagined, yet the weight of that moment pressed heavily against him. Every step back toward the cabin was a vow he had not meant to make. The frost cracked beneath his boots, the dawn widened, and in the quiet cradle of the wilderness, a story neither of them had sought was beginning. As the fire within the cabin waited to be stoked back to life, as the walls prepared to hold more than one heartbeat, Harland walked toward the threshold of change without knowing it. He only knew he could not leave her to die, and in that choice lay the seed of something far greater than survival. It was the beginning of healing, of love rediscovered, of two souls drawn together by fate's quiet hand. And if this tale stirs something tender in your heart, let your voice join ours. Leave your thoughts in the comments, share this journey with others, and subscribe so that together we can walk further into the warmth of this unfolding love. For stories, like hearts, grow stronger when they are carried not alone, but hand in hand. The door to the cabin was waiting, and beyond it, the silence of Harland's world was about to be broken forever. The cabin door groaned on its hinges as Harland pushed it open with his boot, carrying the fragile weight against his chest. The fire inside had fallen to embers, but the warmth still lingered, enough to welcome two souls instead of one. He lowered her carefully onto the narrow bed, the quilt swallowing her broken frame. For a heartbeat she lay motionless, her chest rising shallow, eyes closed, as if she had surrendered to silence. But then her lashes flickered, her gaze cutting through the dim light, watching him as though measuring whether he was a captor or a savior. Harland stoked the hearth until flames licked high again, their glow casting long shadows across the logs. He filled a tin cup, the steam curling softly upward, and held it out. Her trembling hand reached, fingers brushing his for the briefest instant, and the touch startled him more than the echo of gunfire ever had. She drank greedily, water running down her chin, yet there was a dignity even in her weakness, a will that refused to vanish. When he asked her name, her voice, halting, uncertain, gave him one word: Nia. A name that carried the sound of something ancient, something unbroken. The silence that followed was thick, but not empty. He watched her with guarded eyes, remembering the blood on the trail, the rumors of raids, the weight of history carved into his bones. Yet here she was, no enemy, no shadow from the past, but a woman whose chains had been torn from her, body bruised but spirit unyielding. He bandaged her wrists with a gentleness he did not know he still possessed. Every knot tied was not just to hold fabric in place, but to promise that the cruelty of others would not reach her here. She flinched at his touch, but when her dark eyes lifted, steady and searching, he held that gaze without faltering. Hours slipped into rhythm, the crackle of fire, the scrape of his knife against a wet stone, the sound of her shallow breathing. They blended into a fragile song of survival. She ate sparingly, each bite slow, as though her body had forgotten how to receive kindness. He asked little, yet every answer she gave, broken by her accent, was a fragment of a larger story written across her skin. Chains, bruises, loss. Words that did not need length, for the truth lay in the silence between them. As dawn turned into afternoon, she whispered the first fragile plea, her English twisted but clear enough to pierce his guarded heart. "No, kill me." Harland's chest tightened. He set down his blade, leaned closer, his voice carrying the steady weight of a vow. Not here for that. And in that moment, something began to shift, not just in the air between them, but within him. The cabin, once only a shelter for one man's grief, now carried the fragile pulse of trust. Outside, the wind pressed against the walls, a reminder that danger still breathed in the forests beyond. He knew men like the ones who had chained her would not easily forget. But as she drifted into uneasy sleep, her face turned toward the fire, he sat watchful, heart heavy, yet alive in a way it had not been for years. He had thought himself a man finished with tenderness, but here fate had placed a wounded soul in his care, and with her a choice that could no longer be undone. This was no longer survival. It was the beginning of something larger, a story stitched not with fear, but with healing, trust, and the slow rekindling of warmth inside a man who thought love had long since turned to dust. And if this tale stirs a spark in your soul, let it grow brighter. Leave your thoughts, share your voice, and subscribe to walk further with us through this path of love and resilience. For in every story we keep alive together, the fire of hope burns stronger. The night was falling, shadows stretching long, and Harlan's rifle rested close by. But for the first time, the silence inside the cabin was not loneliness. It was the fragile heartbeat of two lives learning how to begin again. The morning after she entered his cabin, the light spilled through the cracks in the logs like liquid gold, stretching across the floorboards and spilling over the bed where she lay. Harlan woke in his chair, stiff from keeping watch, his hand still close to the rifle propped against the wall. He rubbed his eyes, expecting the familiar silence of solitude, but instead his gaze fell upon her. Nia was awake, eyes open, staring at the beams above, her dark hair tangled against the pillow, beads catching stray threads of sunlight. The room no longer felt like his alone. It was altered, marked by her presence, by the unspoken weight of two lives colliding where only one had been meant to endure. He rose quietly, poured water into a basin, and placed it on the table. His voice, low and steady, broke the silence. "You need to wash." She followed his gesture, her eyes flickering between his face and the basin. A small nod answered him. He stepped outside to give her privacy, the cold air biting his skin, the forest stretching quiet and endless before him. Yet, even in the crisp wind, his thoughts did not wander far from the cabin. Men who chained women did not simply vanish. He imagined hoofbeats breaking the stillness, riders searching, danger pressing down from the ridgeline. If they came, he would be ready. But readiness meant more than guarding his door now. It meant guarding her life as if it were bound to his. When he returned, she had done what she could to wash. The torn dress clung to her frame, seams ripped too deep to hide her shame. Her eyes lowered, as if to conceal the flicker of embarrassment. Harlan crossed to his trunk, pulled out one of his shirts, and set it gently on the bed. "Wear this," he said, "nothing more." She looked at it, then at him, lips parting as if to question his kindness, but in the end she only nodded. While she changed beneath the quilt, he turned his back, busying his hands with kindling at the hearth. When he finally glanced again, she sat upright, his shirt hanging loose but covering her fully. For the first time, her posture seemed less like prey, more like a woman reclaiming a shred of dignity. "Better," he murmured, and she gave the faintest nod, almost invisible, but real. Later, when he placed food on the table, she tried to rise. Her legs shook violently, her hand clung to the bedpost, and before she could fall, he caught her by the waist. The contact startled them both. Her breath quickened, her eyes widened, yet she did not pull away. His grip steadied her, strong but careful, until he guided her to the chair. Their closeness lingered in the air long after she sat. She ate slowly, with more strength than before, though her eyes never stopped watching him. "Where from?" he asked, testing her English, his words blunt but soft. She touched her chest lightly, whispering, "Near, my people far." Her hand moved westward, then back to her wrists where rope burns were fading beneath the bandages. She shook her head, voice firm despite its fragility. Not go back. That was all, but it was enough. He understood the weight of exile, the pain of having no home to return to. He did not press her further. The day stretched into rhythm. He split wood outside, his axe striking with measured force, and when he glanced back toward the doorway, she was there, standing uncertainly, her figure framed in the cabin's shadow. She tried walking further, her steps unsteady, but when she faltered, He was there again, his hand steady on her side. Their eyes met in the small space between breath and silence. She did not move away. He guided her back, tucking the quilt around her once more, while the fire crackled low. That night, while sharpening his knife, her voice came soft across the firelight, fragile but piercing. "Why help me?" He paused, lifted his gaze, and answered with the quiet certainty of a man who had made his choice long before he understood it. "Didn't want to see you die out there." She studied him as though testing the truth, and then her eyes closed slowly, her body easing into rest. Harland leaned back in his chair, staring at the flames, feeling the weight of silence transform. The cabin no longer echoed with emptiness. It pulsed with something heavier, yet alive. Trust, fragile but growing. Outside, winter still pressed hard against the timber, and danger lingered in unseen corners of the forest. But within those log walls, something had shifted. The man who had believed he was destined to live alone now found himself drawn into a bond neither planned nor spoken. It was the beginning of healing for both, the spark of warmth born in shared survival, in unguarded moments that stitched two fractured lives together. And if this tale of resilience and quiet tenderness touches your soul, let it rest there gently. Leave your reflections in the comments, share the story's warmth with others, and subscribe to walk with us further into this unfolding journey. Stories like these grow brighter when hearts gather around them, carrying hope hand in hand. As the firelight waned and her breathing softened into sleep, Harland felt it deep in his chest, the knowledge that the silence he had carried for years had already been broken. What came next would change not only his days, but his very reason to keep walking through them. The silence of the forest was broken by the sound of hooves long before they reached the cabin. Harland's ears caught it first, a steady rhythm that carried danger in every beat. He set down the axe, his body tightening with old instinct, and reached for the rifle propped against the fence. Naya, who had been lingering near the doorway with her hands wrapped in his oversized shirt, felt the shift in the air. Her eyes darted to him, wide but steady, as though she knew the storm waiting just beyond the tree line. 3 riders emerged from the pines, their coats dark with dust, their eyes sharper than the cold. They slowed their horses as they entered the clearing, scanning the cabin, the corral, and finally Harland himself. The leader spoke, his voice edged with arrogance. "We heard you picked up something out here. Something that ain't yours." The words hung heavy, carrying not just accusation but ownership, as though Nia's life was theirs to trade. Harland's jaw clenched. He didn't raise the rifle yet, but his stance was immovable. "Ain't seen no one," he said flatly, though the fire in his grey eyes betrayed the truth. Inside the cabin, the floor creaked faintly. Naya was listening. She stayed hidden, but Harland felt her presence like a heartbeat behind him. The riders pressed closer. "She's property," one of them sneered. "Hand her over and we'll ride on. Make it hard, and it won't end clean." The words scraped against every scar carved into Harland's memory, every loss, every cruelty he had once sworn never to allow again. His grip tightened on the rifle. His voice, low but unwavering, cut through the air. "Don't think you boys got business here." For a long, breathless moment, silence stretched across the clearing. The men studied him, their hands twitching near their weapons. Harlan's finger brushed close to the trigger, his heart steady, his resolve unshaken. Then the leader spat into the dirt and pulled his reins. "Hell with it! Not worth the trouble, yet." His eyes lingered with promise. "But you'll regret it." The three of them turned, their horses fading back into the pines. Only when the last hoofbeat dissolved into the distance did Harlan lower the rifle. He exhaled slow, the breath he hadn't realized he was holding spilling out into the cold air. Inside, Naya stood rigid by the bed, her hands gripping the quilt, her face pale but her eyes unflinching. "They know," she whispered. Harlan leaned the rifle against the wall, his voice rough but certain. "Yeah, but they're not taking you." She trembled, and for a moment her strength faltered. He crossed the space between them, his hand brushing her arm. She froze at first, but then her breath steadied under his touch. It was not comfort spoken in words, but the kind that passes deeper, the kind that heals wounds silence cannot mend. That night, the fire burned low, shadows crawling across the log walls. Harlan sat at the table, carefully cleaning the rifle, his motions slow and deliberate. Nia sat across from him, her eyes following every move. Finally, her voice broke the hush, soft but piercing. "Why risk?" He met her gaze, his answer carrying no hesitation. "Because I said I would." She studied him, as though carving the truth of those words into her soul. Then, with a courage born of gratitude and something more, her hand reached across the table, resting near his, not touching, but close enough that he could feel the warmth of her skin. He did not move away. The distance between them had already begun to vanish. The cabin was no longer a refuge for one man's grief. It was becoming something different, something alive with fragile trust and the first quiet notes of affection. The shadows outside might return, darker and sharper than before, but inside those walls light was being born. And if this moment stirs something inside you, let it linger. Share your thoughts, let your heart speak in the comments, and subscribe to walk with us further. For stories of love and healing grow brighter when carried together, hand in hand. The fire dimmed, their hands resting near each other across the wooden table, and Harlan knew with unshakable certainty that his life had already shifted. Whatever danger rode down the trail next, he would not face it alone. The morning air carried a sharpness that set every sound on edge, and when the faint rhythm of hoofbeats stirred beyond the ridge, Harlan knew the men had returned. He set down the bucket of water he had been carrying, every muscle coiling with the memory of yesterday's threat. The forest held its breath. The crows took flight in a rush of black wings, and the ground seemed to pulse with the weight of approaching danger. Nia, standing near the cabin door with her hands curled around the frame, felt it too. Her eyes found his, dark and steady, and though fear lived inside her, it was matched by a determination that had not been there before. 3 riders broke through the trees, the same faces hardened now by frustration. Their leader's gaze cut across the clearing like a blade. "We gave you a chance," he spat. "You should have taken it." Harlan lifted his rifle, his stance calm but unyielding. The second man sneered, venom twisting his voice. "She don't belong here. She ain't yours." Before Harlan could answer, Nia stepped forward. Her small frame was draped in his shirt, the pistol he had let her practice with clutched firmly in her hands. Her voice was halting, her English broken, but the strength behind it silenced the clearing. "I belong here." The words struck like steel. The men shifted uneasily in their saddles, surprise flickering across their faces before anger smoldered in its place. The leader leaned forward, eyes narrowing on her. "You think that cowboy can keep you? He'll die for nothing." Harlan's jaw tightened. His voice, low but steady as iron, cut through the air. "Try me." The silence that followed was heavy enough to snap. One of the riders swung down, hand hovering over his revolver, but Harlan's rifle rose smooth, unshaking, the barrel fixed steady. Nia mirrored him, her pistol aimed, both hands firm the way he had taught her. The man froze. For a heartbeat, the clearing was locked in stillness, 2 against 3. Yet it was the riders who faltered. The leader spat a curse, his face twisting. "This ain't over." Harlan's voice dropped lower, heavy as a vow. "It is, if you ride out now." The tension cracked, and with a sharp tug on the reins, the men wheeled their horses, retreating into the shadows of the pines. Hoofbeats faded, swallowed by the forest, leaving only the echo of what could have been bloodshed. Harlan lowered the rifle slowly, his breath steady, though his chest burned with adrenaline. Nia's hands trembled now that the moment had passed, but her eyes remained fierce. He crossed to her, gently taking the pistol from her hands and setting it aside. His touch lingered against her fingers, warm, grounding. She whispered, her voice breaking but clear. "We fight together." His reply came rough, certain. Together. That night, the firelight wrapped the cabin in amber glow, shadows soft against the walls. Nia sat on the bed, her hands resting on her knees, while Harlan crouched before her, his hand brushing hers with a quiet steadiness that carried more promise than words ever could. For the first time since she had entered his world, he lay beside her instead of taking the chair by the door. Her head found his chest, her breathing soft, and his arm curled protectively around her as if it had always belonged there. The silence was no longer loneliness, it was belonging. When she whispered, "I stay with you," always, he kissed her hair, his voice low but sure. "That's all I want." And in that vow, carved from the rough edges of their survival, the healing that neither had dared to imagine began to take root. The cabin, once a hollow shelter, now beat with the rhythm of 2 hearts learning how to trust, how to stand, how to love. If this story has touched you, let its warmth ripple outward. Share your thoughts in the comments, let your heart be heard, and subscribe so this journey can continue with you beside it. For love, like fire, grows brighter when tended by many hands. And beyond the quiet night, beyond the steady crackle of flames, the forest still held its shadows. But for Harlan and Nia, whatever came next would no longer be faced alone. It would be faced side by side, with courage that no chain, no threat could ever break. The snow had melted into streams that traced silver paths through the slope, and the air carried the scent of wet pine and thawing earth. Life in the cabin began to shift in ways neither had expected. Where once Harlan had risen to silence, now he woke to the soft rhythm of Nia's breathing beside him, her hair spread across the pillow, her presence a quiet anchor against the solitude that had haunted him for years. The walls, once bare of warmth, now bore small signs of her, beads threaded into a strip of leather, a comb resting openly beside his knife, stitches clumsy yet earnest, mending his worn shirt. The cabin was no longer his alone. It was theirs, shaped by two sets of hands, two shadows in the firelight, two hearts learning how to heal through each other's presence. Nia grew stronger with each passing day. Her steps steadied, her back straightened, and her eyes no longer carried only the weight of fear, but a spark of determination that made her seem taller than her small frame. She worked beside him without hesitation, carrying wood from the pile, fetching water, grinding corn into meal. Sometimes her words came halting, rough with her accent, but each attempt was met with Harlan's quiet nod, his simple answers steadying her. She learned table, fire, knife, water, and in turn she taught him soft words from her own tongue, syllables that carried music he could not fully understand but repeated with care. Every exchange was more than language. It was trust, traded one word at a time, woven into the fabric of their days. One evening, as the fire glowed steady, she sat across from him, her fingers tracing the scar along his collarbone. Her voice, soft as the whisper of pine needles in the wind, carried words that sank deep. "You're not alone." The sentence, simple yet profound, broke through years of silence that he had carried like armor. He did not answer immediately, but his hand covered hers, rough and calloused, pressing it against his chest where his heartbeat thrummed steady and alive. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to believe it. He was no longer alone, yet the shadow of danger lingered. Harlan checked the tree line each morning, the rifle always within reach, his eyes scanning for riders who might return to claim what they thought was theirs. Nia knew it too. Sometimes she caught his gaze, her eyes calm but alert, and without words they acknowledged the truth. Safety was fragile. Still, when she picked up the rifle one morning and aimed at the stump across the clearing, her stance steady and her breath slow, he saw not fear but resolve. The crack of the shot split bark clean, and when she lowered the weapon, pride shone in her face. "If they come, we fight," she said. Harlan's answer was firm, his voice low but certain. "Yeah, we fight." Their bond deepened not through declarations, but through the rhythm of shared work. When he saddled the horse, she brought the rope without being asked. When she stirred the pot at the hearth, his hand brushed hers as he passed, their touches no longer accidental, but deliberate acknowledgments of what had grown between them. Each moment was a quiet vow, each silence a place where love breathed. At night, she no longer hid beneath the quilt as a shield. Instead, she leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder, her breath soft against his neck, while his arm wrapped around her as though it had always belonged there. One night, as the wind howled outside and the fire burned low, she looked at him with dark eyes, steady and sure. "Stay always," she whispered. His reply came without hesitation, his voice rough but certain. "I will." Their kiss that followed was deeper than the first, no longer tentative, but filled with the promise of a future neither had thought possible. It was not lust, not desperation, but something rooted in survival, trust, and the healing of wounds too old to name. The cabin, once filled only with the echo of loneliness, now glowed with the steady warmth of belonging. Harlan, who had believed his life ended with a grave in Texas, now felt alive in a way he had not dared to imagine. And Nia, who had been cast aside and chained, now stood not as a shadow of suffering, but as a woman whose spirit had risen, who had found not just safety, but love in the arms of a man who refused to let her go. If this journey touches your soul, let its warmth ripple outward. Leave your reflections in the comments, share this story's healing light, and subscribe so we may continue walking together through the unfolding path of love and resilience. For stories like this remind us that even in the harshest winters, the promise of spring waits quietly, ready to bloom when two hearts dare to hold on. And as the days stretched longer, light lingering past supper, the sound of distant hoofbeats would once again stir the horizon. But this time, neither of them would face it alone. They had chosen each other, and that choice had made them unbreakable. The sound came first like a low tremor in the earth, a rhythm of hooves pressing closer, sharper than the memory of yesterday's storms. Harland froze mid-swing, the hammer still raised above the fence post, his instincts honed by years of war and survival snapping awake. Nia, who had just stepped out with a bucket of water, felt it too. Her hand flew instinctively toward the small pistol strapped at her side, the one he had taught her to hold steady. Their eyes locked across the clearing, no words spoken, no need for them. Both knew what it meant. The men had returned. 3 riders burst from the tree line, dust clinging to their coats, their faces set with a hardness that left no doubt of their intent. The leader's gaze burned with a hunger that was less about possession than pride, the need to reclaim what he believed was his. His voice cut the air like a blade. "We gave you a chance, Cowboy. Should have taken it." Harlan's grip tightened on the rifle leaning against the fence, his voice flat but unflinching. "You're not talking her." Nia stepped forward before the words had time to settle. Her pistol hung low, but her hands were steady, her voice halting yet fierce. "I belong here." The statement carried across the clearing, defying not only the riders, but every chain that had ever marked her skin. The men shifted, surprise flashing quick before anger took its place. One leaned forward in his saddle, sneering. "You think he can keep you safe? He'll die for nothing." Harland raised the rifle, smooth and sure, his stance unshaking. "Try me," he said, every syllable carved from iron. Silence thickened, heavy as storm clouds ready to break. One rider swung down from his horse, hand brushing the revolver at his side. Before he could move further, Nia lifted her pistol, both hands firm just as he had taught her, her eyes locked steady. "Go," she demanded, her voice sharp, ringing truer than the fear she carried. For a long breath, the clearing held its edge. Then the man froze, cursing under his breath as he climbed back into the saddle. The leader's glare lingered, heavy with promise. "This ain't over," he spat. Harlan's voice came back low, unwavering. "It is if you ride out now." And with a sharp tug of reins, the 3 of them vanished back into the trees, leaving the air cracked open by tension, the silence ringing louder than gunfire. Harland did not lower the rifle until the last hoofbeat faded. Then he turned to Nia. Her hands trembled now that the moment had passed, but her eyes stayed fixed, strong, unbroken. He stepped to her, his hand brushing hers as he took the pistol gently away. She did not resist. Instead, her fingers lingered against his a moment longer, grounding herself in his presence. "We fight together," she whispered. His reply was raw, certain. Together. That night, the cabin's fire burned brighter than it had in weeks. Nia sat on the bed, her face softened by the glow, while Harland crouched before her, his hand steadying hers as though anchoring her spirit. She leaned into his touch, not as someone clinging to safety, but as a woman choosing trust. For the first time, he did not return to the chair by the door. He lay beside her, her head resting against his chest, his arm wrapped around her as if he had been made for nothing else but that moment. Her voice, soft as the hush of snow falling in the forest, broke the silence. "I stay with you. Always." He pressed a kiss to her hair, his answer carrying the weight of every vow he had never spoken aloud. "That's all I want." In that warmth, the scars of their pasts began to ease, not erased, but softened, stitched together by the fragile strength of two souls who had survived too much to surrender now. The cabin, once marked by loneliness and grief, now pulsed with life, with hope, with the healing fire of love discovered where neither had dared to search. And if this story lingers in your heart, let it bloom further. Share your reflections in the comments, let your voice join this journey, and subscribe to walk with us as it unfolds. For love, when shared, becomes a light that heals not only those who carry it, but everyone it touches. The forest beyond still held shadows, dangers not yet gone, but as Harlan tightened his arm around Nia and listened to her steady breathing, he knew the truth. Whatever came riding out of those trees again, they would face it not as strangers bound by chance, but as two hearts bound by choice. Summer unfolded gently across the valley, softening the land that had once been hardened by frost and silence. The cabin stood steady against the slope, but inside it no longer echoed with loneliness. It breathed with life, with laughter that slipped quietly from Nia's lips, with the warmth of two hands brushing against each other over the smallest of tasks. What had begun in fear and fragile trust had blossomed into something unshakable. The shelves no longer held only jars of beans and flour. They carried her beads, her comb, the small tokens of a woman reclaiming her life. The quilt on the bed no longer covered just one restless body. It wrapped them both, their heartbeats weaving together in rhythm with the crackle of fire. Harlan watched her move through the cabin with a grace that seemed to cleanse the shadows from its corners. Once she had been frail, her frame trembling under the weight of exhaustion. Now she carried wood in her arms, stirred pots at the hearth, and stepped into the clearing with a rifle firm against her shoulder. Each act was more than survival. It was the reclaiming of her strength, the healing of a spirit that had been bruised but never broken. And he, who had thought himself finished with tenderness, found his heart breaking open anew each time her eyes caught his. In their silence, entire conversations passed, his storm-grey gaze meeting her dark, unflinching one, saying without words, "You are safe, you are mine, and I will never let go." The land around them still whispered of danger. Riders might return, shadows might stretch long from the tree line, but fear no longer hollowed the air between them. For every hoofbeat imagined, they had an answer, the rifle in his steady grip, the pistol in hers, the vow carved in their hearts. Together they had faced the storm and stood unbroken. Together they had turned a cabin of exile into a home of belonging. He had thought love died beneath an oak tree years ago. She had thought hope had been torn from her wrists with the chains. Yet here they stood, side by side, proof that even the deepest wounds can be healed when two souls dare to hold each other. At night, the fire painted their faces in gold. She lay against him, her hair spilling over his chest, her hand resting on the scar along his collarbone as if to claim it as her own. He kissed her brow with the reverence of a man who understood the weight of what had been lost and the miracle of what had been found. She whispered in broken English, "Not leave me." His answer was firm, certain, healing, "Never." And the silence that followed was no longer heavy. It was whole. It was theirs. Days stretched into weeks, and weeks into months. The seasons carried change across the hills, but the bond inside that cabin only deepened. Two voices where there had once been one, two sets of hands shaping every corner, two shadows cast long against the wall as evening settled in. The cabin was no longer a monument to grief. It was a sanctuary, a promise, a living testament to love rediscovered in the most unlikely of places. Harland had set out one winter morning seeking only food for his table. Instead, he had carried back the heart he never thought he'd find again. And Nia, who had been left to die in silence, now lived wrapped in arms that vowed to keep her safe for all the days to come. If this story has touched you, let its warmth ripple outward. Leave a comment to share your thoughts. Subscribe to follow this journey further, and let your heart be part of this circle of healing and hope. For love like theirs does not end within the walls of a cabin. It reaches outward, reminding us all that even after the longest winters, spring always comes, and with it, the promise that no one has to walk alone.